Remember that we're in God's presence. We have been all along, wherever we were over the weekend. Maybe even some strange places where you wouldn't expect to find God. Let's call upon the founder to help us locate ourselves in God's presence. What an unspeakable happiness is mine, O my God, to have you always present, wherever I am or wherever I may go. Should my senses rebel against my being in a certain place, the thought of your divine presence there shall make it sweet and pleasant to me. To be always in your presence and to think always of you, give me a foretaste of the happiness of heaven in this world. Grant me this grace, O my God.
Amen.
Saint John Baptist, thou,
Pray for us.
Lord Jesus in our hearts.
Forever.
Well, if I remember, the last time we were together, we were talking about Jansenism and the doctrine of grace and various theories about the Blessed Trinity. One thing that I perhaps afterwards in reflecting that I wanted to highlight a little more, which I got distracted and failed to do, was one final word about this business of uncreated grace, because I think it has a lot to do about the way we think concretely about grace. And that is, if we recognize that the principal element in what we call grace is uncreated grace, the self-communication of the triune God, God giving himself to us, God revealing himself to us, then the fundamental reality in grace is a relationship. The problem, I think, in our thinking about grace, and of course I say this because it's so evident in our thinking and in the bland thing and so on, is that somehow we tend to think of grace as a quantitative thing. Like a barrel of beer, you pull the tap and then you get more and more of it all the time till you build it up. Then you commit a sin and you lose the whole thing. You've got to start all over again. And to think of accumulating it and piling up. Well, really, that's not the fundamental reality. If the fundamental reality is the self-communication of God, then that reality is a relationship. And therefore, the increase of grace means the intensification of this personal relationship to the persons of the Trinity. So when we talk about getting more grace, for example, the sacraments giving grace, or giving grace by the very rite of the sacrament itself, that means by the very participation in the sacramental liturgy or the sacramental rite, that this intensifies the relationship. And like any other relationship, a relationship can have its ups and downs. A relationship can have it can be destroyed, of course. And it can be reconstituted, but not easily and not often. And so on. So I think the more we can think about grace in those terms, it gives a totally different perspective. And then, of course, the notion that grace is somehow a magical thing that's given or taken away and enables us to do things and so on and so forth. Well, again, even there, if we think in terms of a relationship, there is a transformation of ourselves in the relationship. And so that makes us different people. That conforms to the Catholic doctrine about an intrinsic reality in us when we possess grace. But all of it really, in the long run, comes to the relationship. And of course, if we are in intense relationships with certain people, that enables us to do things that we might not otherwise be able to do. We're able to do things in community, for example, because we have a relationship to the brother. And married couples are able to do things within the family precisely because of the husband and wife relationship and the relationship to the children and the children to the parents. And so it is with our relationship with God. We can do godlike things and things that promote the glory of God precisely because grace fundamentally is this relationship whereby the community, the triune God communicates that divine reality to us to be our personal possession in terms of a personal relationship, to which we therefore are given the power by God to respond. And there's an empowerment. So I hope that helps you think a little bit about grace somewhat differently from the way the 17th century thought about it. Just a word on anything anybody want to say about that?
Karl Rahner has something very special about grace that I found very confusing. And his breakthrough, I sort of thought, was grace from the very beginning. You and I have some kind of spiritual or religious power from the very beginning. And this seems to be independent of, let us say, baptism or anything else, where you and I, from the beginning, have grace. Now, I got a little bit...
Well, that's what I was talking about last Friday when I talked about the supernatural existential, that in the present historical order, there's no such thing as anything that's purely natural. But the God who gives us grace, the God who wants to redeem us, is the God who creates us. So in our very creation, that already is the beginning of the divine communication. It's the same thing, okay? But we can't get into a big theology of grace here. Just a word about Gallicanism, because it was very much in the air. If most of De La Salle's teachers were very strong against Jansenism, some of them were a little flabby with regard to Gallicanism. This is the notion that the French church and the union of church and state in France is somehow divinely guided, and that the important thing about being a Christian is to be a French Christian in a certain sense, and that the king, ruling by divine right, has something relational there with regard to the power of the Pope. So in 1682, Bossuet was commissioned to put together these articles, which got to be known as the Gallican Articles. And just to give you a flavor of it, and now this created an enormous conflict with Rome, between Rome and Louis XIV, and a long process whereby, of course, the king finally had to succumb under the threat of interdict, and having all of the countrymen withdrawn from his jurisdiction, he finally had to compromise a little bit. But anyway, here's the idea behind Gallicanism. First of all, the king is absolutely independent of the Pope in temporal matters. Now, of course, we would say that should be taken for granted, but of course, that was not taken for granted by any Pope. I'm not even sure it's taken for granted by the present one, but certainly up until the 1870, it was presumed that the Pope was a temporal sovereign, and since the Pope was the temporal sovereign with spiritual powers, he had more power even in temporal matters than the local authority. Secondly, that the council that a general council is superior to the Pope. And now, of course, we think that that's a terrible heresy, but on the other hand, who's the first Pope? If John Paul wanted to trace his papacy back, how far would he go? Peter? Peter wasn't a pope to begin with. The word Papa doesn't get used exclusively of the Bishop of Rome until the year 1000. And the first Bishop of Rome to act like a pope was probably Leo the Great in the 5th century. And in the beginning, although we supposedly have the names of those early popes, the fact of the matter is that most all of the episcopes, the bishops, the overseers, were a collegial body, and so that there was not a bishop in Rome, but there were bishops in Rome. Clement of Rome, for example, was not the Bishop of Rome, but a Bishop of Rome, etc. Well, but to answer my own question, the present papacy dates its origin back to Martin V, after the Council of Constance in 1415. In 1415, when the council assembled, there were 3 popes, 3 people claiming the papacy, every one of which had a valid claim. Now, of course, the Romans maintained that the Roman line was the legitimate line, but that's Roman ideology. Nobody knows which one was the right pope. The Pisa pope had been elected by a council when the other 2 were supposedly going to resign and didn't. The Roman pope had the claim of the Roman line, and the Avignon papacy had the claim that the Avignon papacy was founded because the election of Urban VI in 1678 was done by the force of the Roman mobs, and the cardinals were not free to elect a pope legitimately. So the Avignon papacy has a genuine claim. So all three had a good claim. So they got rid of all three in varying ways, one of whom was John the 23rd, by the way, who's now buried in the baptistry in Florence, if you go there. See a big thing up there, there's John the 23rd on the wall in a skinny little coffin. You know, it isn't the one that we know. Well, anyway. So the council elected Martin V on condition that he accept the power of the council to choose the pope, and that he agreed to call general council shortly after that. Big historical debate over that, of course, with the Latin canonists. So the only sure thing, the only sure route back is through Martin V, who was elected by a general council. So this notion that the council is superior to the pope is that the pope is necessarily superior to the council. You have to take a very close look at that Council of Constance in 1450, which, by the way, was the last genuinely ecumenical council in some sense, because it contained not only bishops, but also theologians who were not bishops, emperors, and representatives of all the Catholic countries who were lay people as voting members. So as you can see, I'm a little bit of a Jansenist. I'm also a little bit of a Gallican. The third of these articles is that papal power is exercised in accordance with the canons of the Church of France. Wow, haven't got much enthusiasm for that. The fourth one is that papal decisions in matters of faith are important, but they are not irreformable, a word that comes up in 1870, unless they are made with the consent of the entire church. That in the long run, infallibility belongs to the entire church, which was a big discussion in 1870, and that's another very interesting question. You know, in the definition of papal infallibility in 1870 says when the Pope meets these, does it say the Pope is infallible? It doesn't say the Pope is infallible under these conditions. What 1870 says is that when these conditions are met, the Pope enjoys the same infallibility that Jesus Christ wanted his church to have. So the papal definition of papal infallibility is defined in turn, then it says, they are irreformable of themselves and don't demand the juridical consent of the church. But the definition of papal infallibility defines the Pope's infallibility as the same as that which Christ wanted the church to have. But it has never been defined what the infallibility of the church is. So the infallibility of the Pope, which is defined in terms of the infallibility of the church, which is not defined. So of course, the problem with infallibility, as I would say, is that it gets to be contagious. Papal infallibility was defined in 1870, and the only infallible papal utterance we had since then was or one that could be recognized and claimed to be such, was the definition of the Assumption in 1950. And so we went, all of those popes have been reigning all those years without saying anything infallible. But it gets contagious because the Pope is infallible once every 100 years or so. We get the impression that he's infallible all the time. And then not only is he infallible, but all those functionaries in Rome get to be infallible. And then bishops get to be infallible. All the bishops have to. Or religion teachers get to. Brother Luke said, you know. Or Father Andrew Greeley said. Or Sister Mary Ignatius said. Or the priest told me in confession. We have a priest at our campus who teaches, he's kind of a philosopher type, Father Moraga, but he knows next to nothing about moral theology. But if I express it, and I teach moral theology all the time, it's my specialty. Every once in a while, if I express an opinion in the area of moral theology, the brothers will say, well, I asked Father Moraga, and he says that that's all wrong. I said, he doesn't know a thing about it. But he's a priest, is immediately the thing. Therefore, he's infallible. Well, enough of that. Cartesianism, Descartes effected a major revolution in philosophy in the 1650s. That famous quote, "I think, therefore I am," where he shifted the whole focus of philosophical thinking from looking out there and then abstracting from the external universe and coming to conclusions and so on. And he shifted the whole thing around by starting inside here and then going outside to the universe. It's called sometimes the shift to the subject. So that instead of philosophy operating from the side of the object, philosophy begins to operate from the side of the subject. This was, and of course then, in line with the scientific thinking that was beginning to emerge, he developed this system of, with regard to the physical universe, of methodical doubt. Now, he never applied it to theological or dogmatic issues, but that made them very, very nervous. It meant that that the whole starting point of Aristotle and St. Thomas was the wrong starting point, the starting point of the founder's education. So Descartes was forbidden to be used in any of the schools in France at the time. They might have referred to him and so on. But all of our present philosophical thinking, for example, linguistic philosophy and personalism and existentialism and all that, they can all trace back to this shift in focus in philosophical thought to put the shift onto the subject. But this, although this was already underway at the time, the founder and all of his fellow students were kept from. Quietism is a spiritual movement that took as its name indicates, that before God you remain totally passive. You don't do anything. You don't have methods of mental prayer and things like that. You just wait for the Spirit to take over. Well, it's not a bad idea sometimes. And again, like a lot of things, it was carried to extremes and condemned and everything else and so on. It got mixed up with the Jansenism thing. We can't go into all of those things. There's a little bit more development of it in the formative years. Okay. So that's what's going on in the 18 months that the founder is in the seminary in Saint-Sulpice and taking courses at the Sorbonne in Paris. Is there anything there before we yank the founder out of Paris? Okay, let's go on. All right, so as we well know, in July of 1671, while he would have been finishing up his second year of theology, remember in France at that time, school went right straight into August. The vacation months were the September months. That was based on the notion that the students had to go back home to help with the harvest and the farms. And all that. So don't think of the school year as ending in June, or as we do, in May, or even in July. They'd still be in school at this time of year. So it was towards the end of that year of second theology, his first year at the Sorbonne, his second year of theology, that De La Salle learned of the death of his mother. Then he goes back in September, or in October actually, October the 10th, Feast of St. Denis, starts his third year of theology, and during Holy Week he learns of the death of his father. He stays at the seminary. It's not exactly clear why, after he hears the death of his father. To make the Holy Week exercises, it probably wasn't considered a good time to travel. And then finally he gets back to Reims shortly thereafter to find that he has been named the executor of his parents' will. So here he is, 21 years old, but that's, or not quite 21, and that is, but he was not considered to be he was still a minor, according to French law, until he would be 25. So a committee of 4 people was set up to sort of supervise his execution of the father's will. But the Archbishop approved the fact that even though he was a minor, that he could assume that function. And Gus has already said a lot about this, about the type of confidence that the father had in his ability to manage the family affairs. At that time, his Marie was 18 years old, and John Joseph, the oldest boy, was 12. Jean Louis was 7. Pierre was 5. And young Jean Remy was just about a year and a half old, having been born the year earlier. His sister Rose, the other sister, had already entered the convent a couple of months before. So very quickly, Marie, the only girl at home, and the oldest of the other children, And John Remy, the youngest, went to live with grandmother Perrette L'Espagnole Moet. And so that left De La Salle with the three boys at home. And he had the whole management of all of the family finances, which were very complicated and very extensive. And Brother Augustine has already given you that marvelous document that Arose discovered, giving the account of his guardianship of his brothers and sisters and the great attention for detail that he had. Now, since he's straight out of the seminary and deep into the spirituality of the seminary, where everything centered on the business of spiritual direction and an intense spiritual life, he continued at home pretty much apparently the same type of schedule that he had in the seminary, even introduced reading at meals and so on with his brothers and things like that, and specified periods of prayer for himself. He brought priests in with him and everything else and so on, but he needed a spiritual director. So very quickly, very early in this process, he sought the help of Nicholas Roland, who was a fellow canon, about 8 years older than the founder. The founder was 21 at this time. Roland would have been about 29. And Roland had become a canon of the cathedral a year before John Baptist de La Salle. And so he takes on Roland as a spiritual director. Now, Roland is an interesting fellow. Roland had studied in Paris, and was in Paris in the parish of Nicholas of Chardonnay, which we've already seen, where there was a very intense catechetical activity and an attempt to run a really good Christian school, that Roland became acquainted with what Charles Damia was saying, the remonstrances to the wealthy people in Lyon. And so that, in getting that hold of that message, sort of, Roland then became aware of what Father Barret was doing up in Rouen. And so when he comes back to Reims, he very early made contact with Barret in Rouen, and he often went there to preach. He became acquainted with the work of Barret and made up his mind to try to do something similar, for Barret was most successful in founding schools for girls. So Roland decided that he would try to do the same thing in Reims. So he goes back to Reims and gradually assumes the management of an orphanage there, and helps the sisters and begins to shift their focus in this orphanage to turn it into a school and an orphanage for poor girls, and began to found a stable community of lay teaching women for this purpose. So Roland all along always had a kind of an itch. He was not happy just to be a canon and just to be going to the cathedral to say office all day long. As a matter of fact, he skipped rather often, as we know. And he was called to task for it once in a while because he'd always be off working with the orphanage or doing some other apostolic work. So here's where De La Salle gets a spiritual director, very different from what was going on down in Saint-Sulpice, a spiritual director with an apostolic itch, you might say. So the choice of Roland proved to be very significant. So during all of this period then, from 1672 until the founder is ordained in 1678, for this 6 or 7 years, Roland is a major influence on it. Now, it's possible to think that the founder must have undergone some kind of a vocational crisis at this point, although it could not have lasted very long. For one thing, his theological study is interrupted. If he was trained to see the will of God in events that happened to him, the death of the two parents and being saddled with the family finances and all that might have led him to think that he had made a mistake in the first place by not doing what his father probably wanted him to do, namely go into law. So he probably had to think that through, and he needed lots of advice and lots of help on it. And so Roland, of course, encouraged him very much. So the first thing that he had him do was to go back to school, to finish up, to make sure that he got credit for that third year of theology that he was in the middle of. And so he went to the University of Reims and ultimately got a certificate of assiduity to show that he had got credit for that year. So whether there was continuity between the courses and so on, nobody seemed to care very much, and we're not exactly sure how those courses judged. But at any rate, he did finish out the rest of the school year. And then also, very, very significantly, Roland apparently advised him that he should take the subdiaconate. Now, as we all know, according to the discipline of the church at the time, the subdiaconate was a crucial thing. It doesn't have much historical origin, and I believe the order has since been suppressed in church policy. But at that time, this was the significant step. I remember when I was going through theology, when my class were ordained subdeacons, and they were happy to be running around with the breve, as they say. Now we got to read the breve, and they carry it around all day long and make a big show out of reading the breve here. I suppose most, and of course then they spoke about this is the time when you got the iron pants, because they were committed to celibacy from there on in, and at the time this was considered a major order. So it was a decisive step, and all the more so because there were no ordinations to subdiaconate being held in Reims at that time, and he had to go shopping around, and he finally had to go to Cambrai. Now, both Bernard and Lain have this business all mixed up and the dates all wrong and so on. But again, Arose finally got the ecclesiastical documents attesting to all of these various ordinations. So we now know the correct sequence. But it was in June, he comes back to Reims in April, and by June he's already ordained a subdeacon. While that was going on, now according to the law at the time, all of the movable goods of the estate had to be sold at auction and the proceeds divided among all the heirs equally. So John Baptist de La Salle had to have this big public yard sale, if you will. The assessors had to come in and itemize every single thing that they had and then put it all up for auction. And so I passed out last time that sheet from Alfred Calcutt, who gives us a marvelous little summary of the I guess I didn't bring it with me. Yes, I did. Young de La Salle bids at an auction. So he had to buy back an awful lot of the stuff. And if you go over to the Cahier 48, which is over there in the Lasallian room, if you're interested, you can see a whole itemization of all the things, including who bought what. Not only the itemized list of everything and a value attached to it, but then at the end, who bought the various items. When you're reading this thing, of course, for those of you who are not familiar with the metric system, it says, for example, there was on the ground floor, there was a tapestry of 60 meters. That would have to be 60 square meters. That's about 200 square feet. So you give an idea of the size of the house. They had a tapestry on the wall. That would be, what, measure 20 feet by 10 feet, something like that. Pretty big piece. Don't forget when Calcutt's an Englishman, so when he talks about on the first floor there were 3 bedrooms, the first floor, of course, is the premier étage. That's the second floor in our language. And then I'll say something about the garden, and Gus has already talked about the books. One of the notes there about the books is that most people, not too many people were interested in them, and a lot of them went unsold. So that's one reason for our thinking that a good number of the books, especially the religious books that the father had in his library, de La Salle probably got hold of those for his own use. All right. So here he is now, a subdeacon. He's in charge of the family finances, and this was a busy thing, going around collecting the rents. And although the father apparently had been very loose and very generous with a lot of the creditors, de La Salle went after them tooth and nail, brought some of them to court and everything else, and so forth, including some nuns and all that sort of stuff. With a lot of interesting details associated with that whole procedure and process. But he was determined that in justice this was due to his brothers and sisters. And he was determined to get for them every single cent that was their due. He wasn't one to leave very many loose ends and things like this. So he takes a whole year off from school between 72 and 73. In 73, he resumes his theology at the University of Reims, and he still has 2 more years of theology to go. Now this is a kind of a funny system. So he finished his 3rd year. He did most of his 3rd theology in Paris. Then he did 4th and 5th year of theology, and we don't know very much about those courses. And in 1675, he gets the degree of Bachelor of Theology. Now, it sounds funny to us that here's a man with a Master of Arts all of a sudden getting a bachelor's degree. But to tell you the truth, the same thing happened to me. when I went to study theology at Catholic University, and it proved to be advantageous. When I went to study Catholic theology at Catholic University in Paris, in Washington, not the founder yet, I was sent down there, and I had to sort of wheedle my way in, and something like Adrian Niel. So the superiors finally, well, it was really the faculty at Manhattan College that pushed for this. And so they threatened to send Brother Alban Dooley, an older man, and a tough old bird, who was head of the Latin department, if the visitor wouldn't send somebody down to study theology, they said, we've got to have somebody here. We've got PhDs in every other subject, and we have only amateurs in the field of religion. So it was the college that pushed the visitor for this. So Vic Lally said when he heard that the college was ready to send Alban as a college assignment to Washington to go through the seminary course. Oh, laws, he says, isn't there any younger man who's interested in this? And I had expressed that interest already. So I had such good religion teachers. I had such terrible religion teachers for 3 years in high school and one very good one in senior year. So that was the source of my interest. And a terrible one in the novitiate. So that was, I said, somebody ought to do something about this. So anyway, so when I go down there, I spent a year so the assignment was go to Washington, teach the scholastics Latin, where I had people like Gabe Healy and Andy O'Gara, and teach them some religion as an amateur, and then finish up the MA in Latin, so it won't be wasted. You'll be useful to us in some way if this whole thing collapses, and investigate the possibility of getting into the seminary to take the theology courses. So there was a brother's boy from California here, Father Eugene Burke, the Paulist, who had a high regard for the brother, so he was the contact, and I went to see him. So he was very excited. He said, we've been thinking for years about the need to get somebody besides priests into this theology thing. So it so happened that the dean of the school of theology had just been made a bishop. And so there was only an acting dean, a nice, kindly old bishop, Louis Aaron. And so I went to him and I said, well, Father, what are the chances of enrolling in the school? Oh, he said, brother, they've talked about that sometime, and he says, it's very controversial, and we're not sure what we can do about it. But he said, you look like a priest anyway. He said, you're wearing that habit all the time. And he said, nobody will know the difference, so why don't you just come in and take the courses and so on and so forth and see what happens. So I sort of slid in that way. Well, anyway, what started me on this? So here I am with a master's degree in Latin from Catholic University, enrolled in the seminary, and all of a sudden I find that I'm an undergraduate. And so when the bill came for the tuition, religious got a very, very cheap price for undergraduate courses, more expensive than undergraduate. So my bill was so I was treated as an undergraduate. But then they had given up. If you wanted to take the STB degree, you could. So I remained an undergraduate until I got the STL 4 years later. But so anyway, that's the system. I don't know why I go into all these stories, but anyway. So he gets the Bachelor of Theology. Now the next step, of course, is to get the licentiate. And so by a strange sort of a thing, in order to get the licentiate in theology, what they had to do was go and take 2 years of courses in advanced philosophy. Back to the philosophy again. It's the craziest system you ever saw in your life, which he does. All right? And so in 1676, the next year, the courses don't, a lot of this was apparently done on personal study, and we don't have very much of the details about it. You can read what we know, it's all there in the formative years. But then we get this very interesting thing in 1676, where now, of course, Blanc messes this up pretty badly, as he usually does. But we get this very interesting thing where Roland tried to steer him away from his canonry, and tries to get him into parish work. He hears that Roland was really determined with this very. Now, of course, De La Salle is living at home. He's doing his studies part-time and all that. He's still a canon, going to the cathedral for all that stuff and so on, and all this stuff going on in between. And here's Roland now decides it's time to get to parish. So now it so happens that the pastor of the parish of the old St. Peter's, Saint-Pierre Le Vieux, was tired of being pastor, and he wanted some freedom. He wanted time to study, and he had been one of the professors at the Collège des Bons Enfants, André Cloquet. So Cloquet wants out of the pastorate, and Roland gets wind of the fact that this is open. Also, there was a good friend of Roland, Father Rémy Favreau, who was really anxious to become a canon. But he had the title to the benefice attached to the chapel of St. Peter and Paul in the cathedral. The cathedral had all these chapels, and each one was a money-yielding, revenue-yielding benefice that they passed out to these various priests, all endowed. So he wanted to become a canon. So Roland concocts this scheme whereby he figures, well, wouldn't it be great to make a three-way move? Old Favreau De La Salle can take Cloquet's place, Cloquet can take Favreau's place and have titles to that chapel and get out of being a pastor and so on, and then De La Salle can move up into the pastorate. Now, of course, he's only a subdeacon at the time. That didn't matter, because his only obligation was to make sure that Mass was said in the parish twice a week. Very few pastors didn't function then the way they do now. So it looked like a kind of a good scheme, but they wanted to keep the whole thing on the QT. So they had a meeting in the neighboring diocese. The three of them met, and they got a lawyer they all signed a contract that this was going to work, and they sent the thing on to Rome for approval. Now, how they could do that without the approval of the Archbishop is an interesting question. But anyway, it was sent to Rome. Well, of course, Blain says that he contrasts the reaction of the Archbishop once the Archbishop got wind of it, and it might have been through pressure from the De La Salle family, and I interpret it that way in the book, but Arose now thinks that no, probably even the family didn't know very much about it. He thinks the real clue to the thing was Cloquet himself. When he found out that this benefice in the chapel, it required him to say Mass twice a week and to reside at the cathedral, he said, well, no, that's even worse than the parish. In the parish, I don't have to say Mass at all if I don't feel like it, and I can choose my own residence. So he began to have second thoughts about the whole thing. And so and that's probably the basic reason why it collapses. Although it's quite possible that there might have been some pressure from the founder's family if they got wind of the fact that he was going to resign the canonry. But of course, remember, the family this time are only the kids, the immediate family. But there would be the Mayafairs and all of the other relatives and so on who would not have been too happy with this type of arrangement. So that possibly is there in a small town like that. So at any rate, however, it turns out the thing was finally squelched. And so they annulled the contract, and De La Salle was informed indirectly through his brother in Paris that the Archbishop had decided against the thing. So De La Salle almost resigned his canonry and almost became a pastor of the parish at this point. Right? Then, that very same year, now all of that happened beginning in January. By March, De La Salle goes to Paris, where the Archbishop is, and it was either on the occasion of dealing with this pastorate deal, or shortly thereafter, that he goes to Paris to be ordained a deacon. And he's ordained there by one of the bishops, not by his own bishop, as a deacon on the 21st of March. And so for the next 2 years, he's finishing up the required courses for his licentiate, and then he has this series of oral examinations. They're all detailed there, including the final public one called the Paranymph. If you have this, and some brother on the banks of the Seine in those bookstalls found this poster back, I think, around 1910 or somewhere around through there, and inviting everybody all over the city to come to this Paranymph. Now, the Paranymph was the speaker. He was the one. His name was Paul Picot. And Paul Picot would get up and give a wonderful, big, long oration on the wonders of studying theology and all that sort of stuff. And then these people who had been subject to examinations all day long, he was the Paranymph, he was the bridegroom. That's what it refers to. He was the bridegroom for these new licentiates. And so there are the five of them, all of them then were granted the licentiate degree. That's early on. In January, what's the date of that thing? There's someplace. And so by the beginning of Lent, John Baptist de La Salle is already now a deacon. He's got a licentiate in theology, and at the end of Lent, on Holy Saturday, he's ordained, not in the cathedral, but in the chapel of the Archbishop's Palace. And the Archbishop's Palace is right adjacent to the cathedral, and it is today a museum. And if you go in there to visit the museum, they have some gold plate and some cruets and things, all in gold, that were apparently given to John Baptist de La Salle on the occasion of his ordination. They're identified as such. Almost got arrested taking a picture of them one time. If I get to show my pictures, you'll see a picture of some of them. And then he said his mass the next day in the side chapel, the Lady Chapel of the Cathedral of Reims. And in 1951, on the 300th anniversary of the founder's birth, the brothers in France had a statue put there of John Baptist de La Salle. So if you go to that chapel today, that's probably where he said his first mass on Easter Sunday with a very small, it's a very, very small chapel. And it's probably a very small crowd. Okay, so now we got de La Salle ordained finally. Any question about this? Yes, Bert?
He was 11 years as a canon and then been ordained, and presumably nobody was pushing him to become ordained. Was that, could they then be canons?
Well, he was a layman, technically. Well, he was. It depends on how you define layman. You would have to have had the tonsure, huh? So he was tonsured, so in canonical terms, he was considered an ecclesiastic. But he became a canon before he had any of the minor orders, for example.
So
He could have stayed there forever, oh yeah. But there would have been tremendous pressure on him to be ordained, I'm quite sure of that. Most of them were, even the peer pressure would be tremendous, huh? And there's some evidence that the younger canons who were not yet ordained, a lot of pressure, they were sort of second-class citizens, and a lot of pressure, children should be seen and not heard and all that stuff, and go and do your studies, et cetera, et cetera. So, the treatment we used to give young brothers. Not anymore, we cultivate them, they're too precious. Yes, Fred?
A question about the title.
Yes.
I think that there's formative years right up to the reception of the doctorate, and it was after he was ordained that he did receive the doctorate, perhaps 1 or 2 or 3 years. Is that true?
We'll come to that. Right? We got him ordained here. It's over here. Okay? Can you see over this side of the board? So now he's a priest. And at the tail end of that book on the formative years, I have a couple of, because his life changes radically once he meets Adrian the L, which he will do before the morning's over. But so now here he is, 1678, a priest canon. All right? He's been a canon for the last 12 years. Now he's an ordained priest. But because he's a canon, of course, he doesn't get assigned to a parish or anything like that. So you have to think a little bit differently according to the customs of this time. So, first of all, he's the executor of Roland's estate. And that this time, now, he's already been executor of his father's estate, but where he inherited all of the problems of finance and management and guidance of the younger and being responsible for their instruction. Now that he's the executor of Roland's estate, it isn't so much a question of money, but Roland dumps into his hands, so to speak, this whole business of the sisters. Because Roland ups and dies just a week or so after de La Salle is ordained. As a matter of fact, Roland was already moribund when the founder was ordained on April the 9th. Roland had been in Paris that whole winter trying to get, now, in order to get his sisters approved, legally approved. Again, this union of church and state. We see the same thing happens with the Institute. The ecclesiastical approval and the legal approval kind of go hand in hand. Right? And there was tremendous resistance on the part of any of these civil authorities to have any more charitable works that the town would have to support. So one of their major concerns von Roland's stuff was to try to, the local people in Reims were very, very, very careful about this. They didn't want any new things. And in Paris, Roland was a kind of a big nothing and couldn't get anywhere with the authorities in Paris. So he's there all winter long getting nowhere. Now the first thing they had to get were these letters to Cachet, C-A-C-H-E-D, sort of sealed secret letters. That's what it means, literally. So they had to get these sealed letters before they could even begin to get the opinion of the local authorities, before they could even open up the petition for letters patent, for incorporation. So Roland was unable to do anything with that. He comes back at the end of the winter in late March, April, Holy Week, Wednesday of Holy Week, you know exactly when he came back. And here he finds that there's an epidemic of purple fever among the sisters. And he's already exhausted and weak and from the trip and everything else and so on. And so he begins tending the sisters and giving them less rights and all of that and trying to help them out. So. And doesn't he fall sick with the fever himself and he ups and dies. And just before his death, he calls in De La Salle and tells him that he wants to make him the executor of his will. He and this Nicolas Rogier, another young canon, who apparently at the time was not yet ordained. And so De La Salle agrees, and Roland dies at the age of 35. And here's De La Salle with this whole thing. And now, there's a good analysis of that in there, dependent on Rose, of course, but there were all sorts of other people. For example, why didn't he make Remy Favreau? Remy Favreau was a good friend of Roland and quite wealthy, and was the one who gave Roland all of his financial support. And as a matter of fact, it was the financial backing of Favreau that was a big factor in getting the sisters finally approved, or getting the local people at least to accept them as an independent outfit. So he could have. There was Guillaume Rogier, one of the older canons, who was also a good friend of Roland's, who was more experienced and so on. De La Salle was not eligible, for example, to be the superior of the sisters because he was under, according to canon law, he had to be 30. And he wasn't quite that yet. So there's all these problems. But anyway, Roland apparently was determined that he was going to get this man into apostolic work somehow or other. And so his first attempt failed, but his second attempt works as a dying wish. So De La Salle sets about this immediately. The Archbishop agreed to let him be the executor of the will for the finances, and he agrees to let De La Salle take charge of getting the sisters approved, but he appoints Guillaume Rogier to be their superior. But he was already the pastor of a parish, so effectively De La Salle became their chaplain and came to say Mass for them very often. So De La Salle sets very assiduously, Bland loves that word, assiduously gets about the business of getting this thing approved. Now, the first step were these letters to Cachet. And all of a sudden, the Archbishop, now that Roland's out of the way, the Archbishop gets interested. And so within 2 weeks, he had the letters to Cachet from Rome. His brother was a big minister in the court of Louis XIV, and the letters to Cachet came very, very quickly. So De La Salle could now act. So he had to get together all of the superiors of the religious houses, all of the city councils and everything else, and all that summer in the month of August, here he is trying to win them around to get their nihil obstat, to get their kind of official approval so that the request could be forwarded to the king. And ultimately it's successful, and finally on the following February, the letters patent arrived so that the sisters are now legally incorporated and given a certain independence. The conditions that, though, and of course De La Salle had to be very careful here because he wanted to be faithful to Roland's vision, but at the same time, he had to put things in there that would satisfy the authorities. For example, that the sisters would not be dependent on the charity of the town in any way, that they would always remain lay women without cloister and without vows. Interesting. Because they didn't want to start another religious congregation with all the benefices and dowries and everything else attached to it. So there were an awful lot of those things. That they would, that their numbers would never exceed 20, and the limited number of students that they could take into the orphanage, etc. the copy of the document, the letters patent, the sisters still have. If you go to Reims, the sisters are very, very generous and hospitable. If we ever get a Buttimer IV, we'll have to go visit the Sisters of the Infant Jesus. And they're very nice to you. They take you in, and they know you're a brother, and so on. So they'll take you all through the house. And there in the main parlor, there's two big pictures, one of De La Salle and one of Nicholas Roland. These are our two founders. Huh? Then they bring you downstairs where Roland's buried, underneath the floor of their chapel and so on. And so they're very, very nice. And at one point, this nun brings out this big white box, and square box. She opens the thing up. Yeah, you jump. There's the head of Nicholas Roland with the box. They took a death mask of him, huh? And with this little mustache and so on. He looks like he's only about 35 years old. But then they'll trot out of the box the letters patent. And there's the letters patent with the signature of De La Salle and the signature of Louis XIV and all the rest of it. So it's an interesting experience to visit. Yes,
Could you comment more about the aspects of their life that they were not cloistered and not members of another religious order? How did that fit into the times?
Well, that was part of the trouble, huh? Because it was something similar to what De La Salle was doing. It didn't fit the canonical categories. And interestingly enough, there was no question here of going to Rome about the whole thing either. Huh? So I've summarized it here.
I suppose over time they had to give that up.
Oh, well, little by little they expanded. But to bring that up to date, by the way, Yves Poutet, Brother Yves Poutet, is now the vice postulator for the cause of Nicholas Roland, and it's moving along. Huh? But the problem they're having with it is that Rome is reluctant to move that process too fast because they say, well, what meaning does this have apart from the Diocese of Reims? Because they always remained a diocesan congregation, which of course is what Letellier wanted to do with us. So I don't know how far Poutet has gotten trying to overcome that obstacle, but that's why he asked any brothers who were interested to write to him or write to Rome and say that Roland was very significant, that the significance of Roland is the impact that it had on the brothers of Christian schools. So I think I'm a little fuzzy about the exact conditions here, but I think I mentioned some of them. Some of the major, on page 118 of this, the second paragraph, some of the major issues to be settled were the following: that the sisters of the community retain their lay status without cloister, without solemn vows. Their number be limited to 20 and 30. They be independent financially, responsible for finances only to the archbishop, so the town council would have. Control over those to be admitted to the orphanage and to the classes. The age limits, the disposal of patrimonial goods had to be shared with the city council. Finally, the conduct of gratuitous classes was to be strictly limited to the sisters themselves without any outside assistance. So you can see the concern for not getting involved in a canonical situation and not getting the city, not putting a financial burden on the city is what comes down to it. Okay?
Do Roman sisters exist in any form or shape today?
I just talked about
the same kind of sisters.
Yes, the same existed, sure.
Oh, that's a long time, isn't it?
Yeah, well, some brothers were around a long time too.
Sisters, they were complaining at the council that they don't want any more sisters and so on. There's so many of them, you see. They were worried that they would be a burden, you see. So I thought perhaps.
Oh, no. And the Sisters of Providence of Barret, I think they still exist. And the Sisters of St. Charles, founded by Damien Lyon, they still exist. An awful lot of those small French orders of sisters. Okay. So De La Salle is successful in his role as executor of the estate of Nicholas Roland. He becomes a doctor of theology. Now, when they had this paranym, they were ranked. And the best evidence is that De La Salle was not ranked as number one. And there's a big fight here between Boutet and Arose over whether De La Salle was the smartest of the lot or not. But anyway, Boutet always tries to tone down a little bit. You know, I don't think he has much respect for the founder's intellectual accomplishments, and I'm inclined to agree with him a little bit. He was not a brilliant theologian, certainly, or a brilliant scholar. I think Gus has already, I think, made clear those facets of his personality and of his character. But at any rate, the ranking was important because it was expected that within 2 weeks they could apply for the doctorate. Now again, I had this kind of similar experience. And you raised this question before, Frank. But in the Paranymph, those examinations were very rigid, and they would have to defend theses orally. They would have to take some kind of a specific proposition. One of them on standard theological things, another one on a controversial issue. And over the course of the 2 years, they would have to defend those before the whole faculty and everybody else and so on and so forth, and plus a completely thorough review of all of the facets of theology, scripture, dogma, morality, all the rest of it. So, and in preparation for this, of course, a lot of it was done by private study. It's not so much a question of passing courses and filing up credits or writing a written dissertation. When the doctorate came along, the principal problem here was paying for it. The fees were very, very high, and it meant reviewing the same old stuff. There were 2 more examinations, but they were more or less a rehash of this thing, again with the defense of some kind of an oral thesis. Now, it was expected that these licentiates, if they were going to go on for the doctorate, that they would do so almost immediately. My own experience is that the oral examination for the licentiate was very, very rigid. We had, and it's the same thing. We were given 100 printed theses in Latin covering the whole field of theology, which you had to be able to defend any one of them. Then you went in for an oral exam. They never trusted. One of the reasons is people cheated all the time, so they didn't trust anything right. So you had to sit in front of a board of 4 professors and be able to spout at great length and develop at great length any of these theses, any one of the 100. And they usually pick out 1 or 2 in each area to see if you could handle all that stuff. So that was when it came to the doctoral thing. If I remember, I took another course or 2 just for the hell of it. But then all of that in my time was a written dissertation. And so by the time you came to defend that, you knew more about it than the professors did. And if you had any sense, that was minor things. That was somewhat similar in the founder's time. To go on for the doctorate didn't mean much more except paying the fees and reviewing the material and being subject to another exam. But almost everybody did it within, according to the sequence, within 6 months or a year. He delayed. Now, why did he delay? That's a good question. Not everybody went on for the doctorate. And it's interesting that he decides to go for it in 1680, when he's already somewhat involved with the Yale. So maybe he wanted to, I think the best guess is that he wanted to keep his options open. Now, Blanc says 81. Rose and everybody else thinks that can't possibly be right. It's too long a stretch for one thing. And my affair says 1680, and that's probably correct. So at any rate, he gets the doctor's cap in this solemn ceremony, and so now he's a doctor of theology in 1680. Gus?
Just to give a little more detail, De La Salle was the executor of his father's will from 72 to 76. In 76, because he was getting ready for his ordination and his STL, he turned the guardianship of his sisters and brothers over to an uncle who kept it from 76 to 80. And then De La Salle took up the guardianship again in 80 for the next 4 years. That would be a strong argument for saying that he took the doctorate in 80, and then when he finished the doctorate, he once again took back the. Now, the only one of the 4 accounts that has survived, 4 different accounts, twice by De La Salle, twice by his uncle. The only one is the first one, 72 to 76. Interestingly, the others were there, someplace in the file. But he gave it up again in '84, back to his uncle, in order to give his full-time employment.
Remind me to say something to you about that after.
Yeah. You say it now, I don't mind.
No. Well, I have, in the book here, it's just the detail about the uncle. In the book here, I say cousin. There are a couple of people named Nicholas L'Espagnol. Right? His mother's, who was his grandmother, Perret Espanol, one of her brother, which would have made him his uncle. No, his mother's brother, Nicole, had a Nicholas. All right? I have to get this. I have to get it straight again. But then there's another Nicholas, who was a cousin, but the descendant of another. Was it Nicholas Espanol? Nicholas L'Espagnol.
That was, I think, one of the original 4
Yes.
guardians.
Yeah, but was that a L'Espagnol or was it a Moet? See, if it was his uncle, it would have to be a Moet, wouldn't it? Anyway, so that uncle cousin thing, and I forget now whether uncle is right or cousin is right. That's why we'll have to look at that. It's not terribly important.
Family was displeased with the second time that he took over the.
Yes. And of course, by this time the brothers were probably the school teachers were probably already in the house. That may be another reason why he wanted to do that, to reassume control. Okay, so that's 1680. So he's a doctor of theology. He's a minister. There's a couple instances of where he received converts from neighboring dioceses, so he must have been pretty effective in the confession. And of course, he's saying Mass, and Blain has a lot of stuff about the intensity with which he celebrated the Eucharist and how people like to come to his liturgies, of course, with his back to the people. There's that interesting story. Did you all read the story at the end of the thing about the time he blew the whistle on the cannon? Did you get to the end of this? That's a lovely little story, and Blain refers to it very indirectly. It's on page 19 of Blain. On one occasion, the young minister of the Lord gave proof of his zeal by censuring an ecclesiastic who gave bad example. This led to his being criticized and to a good deal of gossip on the part of those idle people who make slander their habitual occupation and never inclined to give a verdict in favor of piety. Del Sal tried in every way to make this man realize what he was doing when he said, well, of course, the thing is, one of the canons was shacking up with a servant maid. And so De La Salle blew the whistle on him, and now My Affair has the same thing. In the Quinn's translation of My Affair, he misses this whole point. He misses the point of what it is. It's a mistranslation. But the one you have, I think, is accurate. But De La Salle blows the whistle. But apparently the reaction in Reims was terrible. Everybody kind of knew about it, but this was, you don't do this. You don't wash your dirty linen in public, etc., etc. So, of course, the guy denied it, and they set up 2 canons to investigate who were on the fellow's side, so De La Salle wasn't satisfied with that, and they insisted on changing the thing. The fellow denied it, and denied it, but finally they got, after a long process of a year, they got the servant girl to testify. And so that did it for the old canon. And so the poor old canon was condemned to spend a year at a seminary and deprived of all of his faculties and everything else and so on and so forth. But he never did any of those penances, and he just moved to another diocese. And as Blain says, instead of changing his life, he just changed his residence. So there was a little bit of clerical hanky-panky going on in those days too. Okay. So that brings us, I think, to here's De La Salle now, and at this point in his life, and he's a priest and very comfortable and happy and all that sort of stuff. But in 1679, he happens to go to the sister's place, and who will he meet at the door? What will come? Now, see, Blain does this too. Huh? What will come? What will happen when he comes to the door of the sisters? Who will he meet there? What will the consequences be for the future? Well, come back at 11 o'clock. So the